My name is Colin Torney. I'm from the School of Mathematics and Statistics at the University of Glasgow. Yes, I'm based in the School of Mathematics and Statistics, but a lot of my research is around movement ecology. And mainly I work on wildebeest, Serengeti wildebeest, shown in the picture. So I'm going to talk about three projects at various stages of, some earlier than others, some just being published. But just to give an overview of different projects I've been working on recently, see how time goes. Feel free to stop me. We can skip one or two if we run out of time. Well, I'm going to start talking about activity classification, edge machine learning. So edge machine learning is when you take these machine learning models and you put them right where you're collecting the data, so on the wildebeest, effectively. I'll say that. So most of my research takes place in Serengeti National Park. So this is just a map. I can explain where we are. This is Kenya. Yeah. So Nairobi is Tanzania, Lake Victoria. The Serengeti National Park is one of the most well-known parks, I think, globally. But Tanzania is certainly the most economically important park, and also one of the most ecologically rich areas. And this project is working with a few different partners. So we work closely with Frankfurt Zoological Society and Tanzania National Parks. And over the last few years, they've been setting up an array of gateways. So these are radio towers that can receive data. So this is pretty much like a mobile phone tower, except it's specialized for their particular devices. And they've had this array of gateways throughout the park, and they're using them to monitor rhinos and also vehicle traffic, so they know where all their ranges are. And they have all this data coming through live. So this is the control tower this is in Grumeti Reserve, which is right next door to Serengeti, and they can see in real time where the animals are, where the ranges are. If there's anything going on, they can direct people in certain areas. So it's a really nice system. Obviously, it's quite expensive to set up these types of systems. So, if they're there, we want to try and make use of it. And so to try and utilize this system, we've developed this LoRa collar. So it's a collar which is specifically designed to work with this array of gateways, so this communication system. And the main thing we wanted with this collar, we wanted GPS positions. So there's like a little GPS device here. And we also wanted to know something about the behavior. So we didn't just want location, we wanted to know location plus behavior, and how they're behaving at different points of the migration in different regions of the park. So that, if we can say if they build a new tourist lodge, how that affects not just where the wildebeest are, but if they go close to it, how do they behave? How do they respond to that disturbance? So we're using this Arduino library called TinyML, and this is just a way to take a model, like a deep learning model, and compress it so it's small enough to fit on one of these tiny devices. So we designed a neural network, which is quite small compared to the types of neural networks that people use for image analysis and language processing. It's just a few layers. And the idea is that you can process this live stream of accelerometer data and come up with a prediction based on what the signal is telling the algorithm, make a prediction to one of four behaviors. So it's deliberately small, so it can fit into the memory of the device. So to train these models, you need to get data. So you need to have labeled training data. It's very difficult to do that in Serengeti because once you put a collar on these wildebeest, they just disappear. You never see them again, or maybe see them again if you're very lucky. But we really need to follow these animals and record them, minute by minute, and know exactly what they're doing. So we went to a golf resort, which is up here, which is just close to Serengeti National Park, near the airport. So this is sort of the main tourist airport, and it's this nice resort where it's a very fancy golf course. But they also have a small herd of wildebeest, semi-captive wildebeest, where they're quite predictable where they're going to be each day. So this is what we did just before Christmas last year, so around this time last year. So we went out and collared 6 animals and put these accelerometers on the animals so that we could follow them and sort of collect labeled training data. So the wildebeest weren't. There's been a lot of drought, or there was a lot of drought last year. So you can see that there's quite a big difference between the golf course, which is actually maintained and watered, and where the wildebeest actually are. So
Excuse me, to train the neural network, you have to watch the animals to see what they are doing.
Yeah. So you need to have the accelerometer data
and
the label that goes with it. So for each 10,
you label the different behavior.
Yeah. So we have we split it into 10-second segments, and then we want to know for each of those segments what the actual behavior the wildebeest was doing at that time. Yeah, so I mean, it is kind of green up. There was a bit of rain while we were there, and the wildebeest was sort of behaving quite naturally. They were moving around, grazing, and so we spent a lot of time just following the animals around. So these collars were different. They weren't LoRa collars, because LoRa has quite a restricted amount of data you can send, you can transmit at a time. So these were equipped with a Wi-Fi transmitter. So we'd get close to them, we'd connect to the Wi-Fi network on the collar, and they would transmit the full accelerometer data back to the laptop. So we could collect the data live, so we knew everything was working, and then we just had to record. So there's a camera there, so we were recording the wildebeest and we're collecting the live data. Yeah, so there's a lot of time spent just sort of following these animals around. It's a bit like sort of Blair Witch Project for wildebeest, but I mean, we're in this kind of semi-wooded area, so we couldn't really use the vehicle that much. So I think it stabilizes soon, and you'll see the collared animal. And then we had this sort of handheld data logger. So as the animals change behavior, we push the button that says, walking, grazing. So, in these areas, there's one person on foot that would follow them and get close to them with the Wi-Fi receiver. And there's the animal there just plodding along. So that we'd be recording walking with that.
Are there predators? No.
Not here, no. Yeah, so that's something
that behavior is
yeah, I mean, that's something we're a bit worried about. I mean, I'll talk about that in a second, but there is, we did notice there was differences between these wildebeest and the Serengeti wildebeest. So you see there, the Majaligo, he's a PhD student. He had the logger in his hand there, so he's recording the behaviors. And yeah, we're just trying to keep track of these animals. I mean, when they run, it's really hard to keep up, but we didn't get much running, a lot of walking, a lot of grazing, lying down was fine. But yeah, just a bit of effort to kind of keep up with them. And when they go out of range, we had this problem where the collar the collar was programmed to come on every couple of hours, but if it lost signal and we didn't disconnect in time, then it would get confused and crash, and then you wouldn't see it for a few more hours. So yeah, so this is the confusion matrix. So we trained on these on the captive animals or semi-captive animals, and we had 4 behaviors we want to try and predict. And this is the validation data for those. So we left out some, not individuals, we left out some samples, trained on the rest, and predicted on the left out validation data. And what we see, I mean, so some of these behaviors are quite distinct. So grazing obviously is very separate. You can tell that, and you can see that in the time series that, when they're grazing, the head is down. You can see the angle of the collar, and that changes. There's a bit of confusion between walking and standing, and I think that's more just because these behaviors are, there's a constant back and forth. They're walking, they're standing, they're walking, they're standing. We have these 10-second 10-second windows. We have to classify every behavior into one of those, or every window into one of those behaviors. So I think the behaviors themselves are actually quite easy for the algorithm to distinguish, but it's just that we can't label, within one window, there's 2 behaviors, so there's a bit of confusion. And then we did see that it was quite good at detecting or telling the difference between standing and lying. I mean, these 2 behaviors were the most confused, but it could distinguish between them. And this is something that probably will not generalize to the Serengeti wildebeest. And that's mainly because the lying behavior you can distinguish because the head is up. So when they lie down, the head is more raised than when they're standing. But when they're vigilant and standing, then the head is also up. I think we have this issue where standing head down, they can distinguish, but standing head up, which is what they would do more if there's predators around, if they're a bit more nervous, it's harder to tell the difference between that and lying down. And then it is just a 10-second window, so we don't have the lying down event, which is something that's kind of back in the previous history. They could be running, yeah. So running would go into the walking category. So any running we saw, we allocated it to walking. So this is technically walking / running. But yeah, I mean, they don't run that much, to be honest. It's quite, if they're being chased, if there's a predator in the area, they might run, but most of the time they are just sort of plodding along. Yeah, so one of the main reasons we wanted to do this was to look at energetics, how much energy they're expending in different parts of the park. So they think the difference between walking and running, because they're running for such a small amount of time, shouldn't really change too much, the calculation. But we did talk a lot about whether that should be a separate category. But there was a good reason to stick to 4, which I'll talk about now. Yeah, so we did the actual deployment of the collars for the Serengeti wildebeest in April of this year. We put out 8 collars, and so these are collecting data on the location and the behavior, and they're sending them over the network. They're solar powered, so they, in theory, I mean, they should run forever, or as long as the electronics last. The batteries don't seem to be going down, but we have had some attrition, say. Yeah, so every hour they send a location, and they also classify 30 minutes of behavior. So they have this cycle where they get the location, record behavior for 30 minutes, transmit for the remaining time, and then go back to, if they transmit everything, then they go back to sleep, and then wake up on the hour. Yeah, and then the collar, the behaviors are encoded into these, we had to try and condense it down as much as possible. So we have each behavior is encoded into a 2-bit code, and then we can transmit, we stack all these together, and then we can send, the 30 minutes is 45 bytes. And the reason that's important is that the LoRa network has these packet size constraints. So, you're really limited to how much you can use this network. So it's very long range. You can send things a long way, but you can't send a lot of data. And the more data you send, the more it reduces. So if you send a large packet, you can send that, but you can't send it as far. And we want to send it as far as possible because these gateways are quite scattered around. So we had to come under this 51 byte limit to get these sort of long range data rates. That's why, if you go to 5 behaviors, then we have to send it in 2 messages, and that becomes a lot more complicated to code and deal with. Yeah, so in April this year, we went out, we collared these animals. So we thought it would be the other way around. We thought the wildebeest in the golf course would be the sort of the healthy, happy ones, but it turns out the wildebeest in the golf course were pretty skinny, and there wasn't much resource for them. The wildebeest in the Serengeti were a lot bigger, a lot fatter. Yeah, so they seemed a lot healthier and a lot more grass around. And yeah, so the collars, as I said, they have the solar panel on the back. So in theory, they should go forever. I mean, they get in as much energy as they expend each day. And as we're close to the equator, we don't have to worry about winter, like seasonal cycles, if they work. I mean, we put them out in the rainy season, so they worked fine. So, fairly confident that the solar panel is delivering enough power. And the data we've been getting back, so we couldn't follow them and validate the results we were getting. So we did try, but then, you have a lot of wildebeest around and you just quickly lose them. And also after they're collared, they're very upset. They're not happy. They run off. You see the vehicle coming towards them again, then they're off. So we couldn't get that sort of validation data of seeing, how the Serengeti wildebeest behave and how that corresponds to what the algorithm predicts. But what we could do was look at the data and say, does it make sense? So this plot is saying how much is the algorithm predicting they were walking versus how much did they actually move in that 1 hour interval. So what we would hope would be that, if the algorithm is saying they're moving a lot, then we'd see a larger distance, and that's what we get. So it's a very rudimentary check, but it is saying, if they say they walk a lot, then they travel, then the GPS agrees with that. And if they say, for the 30 minutes, they're not really doing anything, then the GPS also predicts that they didn't move that much. And this is just from two collars that we've been getting data from. And this is the track. So this is the 1 hour fixes for one of these animals, and this is the activity pattern. So we're quite happy to see this because this kind of agrees with how we think they behave, and that we do have these very distinct peaks of grazing. So this is around sunrise and around sunset. So that's where they're more active and when they're grazing. And then during the day, they sort of settle down. It's hotter, they're not doing as much grazing and a bit more sort of walking around, and then more lying overnight. So yeah, so lying sort of peaks just before dawn, and then they start grazing. So we don't have the sort of formal validation, but we can look at the data and say, yeah, this sort of agrees with our perceptions about what they're actually doing each day. So as I mentioned, that's from 2 collars, and this is these are the latest readings. I copied this down yesterday, took a screenshot. So this is each of the 8 collars is showing like when we got the last message from them. So you can see that some of them are coming in sort of this month or a few days ago, and some in October. Some we heard, so we deployed them around the 16th of April. So we heard from these 2 for a few weeks, and then they just disappeared, gone off the radar. And then a few, there was one in May we haven't heard from since May. So that one's probably gone as well. Yeah, so I think our main issue now is just trying to make sure these collars are robust enough and that they're going to last. So the fact they're still going after 7 months, it tells us that the technology works, but it's just not quite not holding up well enough. Because the idea is to really go roll this out to a larger scale deployment, 50, 70 collars, and we don't want to put out 70 collars and have 25% work. Yeah, so the next stage is we're trying to redesign the collar, and this is the next version. And the main thing we've changed is changing the battery that we're using, and going for a much more sort of robust battery that sits on top. And then we've redesigned, so instead of taking components and sort of commercial components that you can buy off the shelf and linking them on a PCB, we're getting the actual chips and putting them directly, so it's smaller. We can put the battery on, and hopefully it's more robust. But that's the next phase, is to try and we have the proof of concept, but now we just need to make it actually work.
But this is without the processor.
No, this is the processor here. So it's on the back side of it. So if you turn it upside down, you see the processor.
It's also an Arduino.
No, this is the Raspberry Pi. So yeah, so this is a slightly different. You can run the same code or very similar code on the Raspberry Pi. It's like a Raspberry Pi Pico, I think it's called. And the reason for this is that the form factor is just much smaller, so we can really sort of shrink things up. And yeah, so it's on both sides. So we have everything, all the pins on this side and the microprocessor on the other side. So just sort of squeeze it down, and then we can get everything in roughly the same size as the previous device. But now we also have the battery on top so before, the battery was just sort of sitting underneath and it could move around. And it also was, not the most expensive battery, one of these kind of model aircraft batteries. I think my guess is that's the main issue we've been having. And also talking to Juan about his sheep collars. I mean, I think he had similar issues with those types of batteries. So we decided that the cylindrical, sort of more solid lipos are the way to go. Yeah, so that's one project's kind of ongoing. Sort of first phase complete, I'd say, and then we're going to the next phase, which is robustifying it. And yeah, so we're going to talk a bit more now about machine learning, but in a bit more abstract sense, talking about collective movement data and simulated data and graph neural networks, and more complex neural network models. So graph neural networks, so kind of similar to a convolutional neural network, which it's very popular for use with images. So in a convolutional neural network, you slide over a receptive field, and you have this very clearly defined structure to your data. So you have a grid, and then So the red dot here in a convolutional neural network would just be able to pay attention to its near neighbors. So it has this very well-defined structure. The graph neural network just relaxes that constraint and says that any sort of arbitrary network structure you can use and you can model within this framework. And this isn't the best example here, but you can imagine that this network could have long-range connections or much more complex structure rather than just looking at near neighbors. Another nice thing about these graph neural networks is that you can add in these attention mechanisms. So based on node features or edge features, you can weight individuals more than others, and sort of attention mechanisms can sort of learn which individuals and which features are important. And this is basically what's in the transformer architecture, so the ChatGPT architecture. So this is the main equation from this, the attention is all you need paper, which was out a few years ago, which led to these transformer architectures and this big growth in large language models. So the attention equation is taking these, so there's a query, a key, and a value, and what it's doing is it's using the query and the key to figure out which individuals to pay attention to. And then if the query and the key, so an individual has a query, its neighbors have the key, and then it raises the query, it asks its neighbors. If they match, then it pays attention to its neighbors and it gets a large weight. And then you weight that value. So the individual's kind of aggregating these values according to this attention weight. And then this is just the equation from the Vichek model. And you can kind of see how these things are closely related. So here, you're weighting your attention function is just giving a very high weight to individuals within your neighborhood. So if your individuals are within a distance threshold, you give them a very high attention. If they're outside that threshold, you give them 0 attention. And you could sort of reformulate this in terms of a attention function and a softmax. So the softmax just sort of makes it into an average of these values, which is exactly what is done in the Vichek model, just averaging the headings.
Is it like a hard threshold?
In the Vichek model, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, that would be slightly difficult to encode here, but it's definitely possible that you could make it so you have this very hard threshold. So basically, you'd want to get this, if they're within the threshold, you want this to be as large as possible, plus infinity. If they're outside the threshold, then it would be negative infinity, and you put it in the softmax, that gives them 0 attention as soon as you cross the threshold, and attention 1 over neighborhood, or 1 over number of neighborhoods for the other one. Yeah, so that's just to say that there's a similarity between transformers, graph neural networks, and collective movement models, which seems to suggest they go well together. So we've been using these in 2 ways. I'm just going to talk quickly about the first way, which is a paper that's published now, but I just want to give a kind of quick sketch of how we use them in this project. So we use them for approximate Bayesian computation. So this is a way if you want to fit a model to data, but you can't calculate the likelihood of your model given your data, but you can run simulations. So it's just a more formal way to say, what are the best parameters for my simulations given my observed data. So you simulate your model, and then you look at your simulation, the results of your simulations. You look at the real data and say, are they close enough? Do they match? And if they match, you keep those parameters, and if they don't match, you throw those parameters away. You keep doing that until you have a distribution of parameters that's your posterior distribution. But then you have to think about, okay, what do you mean by close? How do you decide whether to accept or reject simulated data versus real data? So if your simulated data is an individual-based model, you have hundreds of individuals, they all have velocities, positions. How do you compare that with real data? And the way you do that is with some sort of summary statistics. You have to extract some summary statistic from your observed data, from your simulated data, and put it to a distance metric, and then accept or reject. And there was work about 10 years ago now from Fernhead and Prangle, which said that the best choice of summary statistic you can use is the posterior mean of your parameters given your data. So if you knew the parameters that generated your data or generated your simulated data, that would be the best summary statistic to use. So if your model has 5 parameters, then you should have 5 summary statistics, and they should map you should be able to map your fine scale, micro scale data back to each of these parameters. So you can create something that will extract these summary statistics by training a neural network to predict the parameters that we use to generate micro scale data. So you don't need the real data for this process. You're just training some dimensional reduction algorithm, take complex high dimensional data, come back into just a few numbers, a few scalar values that will give you an effective summary statistic. So this is how that's worked. You just put there's no real data here, but you're just creating a neural network that can extract summary statistics from complex data. You have a question?
So that you're using
yeah.
I mean, if you use this dimensionality reduction, you're compressing information.
Yeah.
How is that, for example, related to the mean of the model?
It doesn't have.
I mean, it's like the mean is like a compressed version of. I mean, intuitively for me, I think a moment is a description of you can describe the distribution with different moments, different characteristics of the distribution, but if you use compression with one of these algorithms, it's not the same as.
But the summary statistic doesn't have to be the same as a moment.
Okay.
It can just be anything you extract. So it's just some quantity you're measuring.
Okay. And do you have to define it? You say, because you usually say, okay, my summary statistic is small. And then you say, okay, my summary statistic is compression made by this algorithm. And you go with that.
I mean, so like the order parameter could be a summary statistic. So if you look at the average velocity of your individuals, that would be a summary statistic, or the average position. But you could also look at, what's the maximum speed of any individual, and that would be a summary statistic in this sense.
Yeah, but in terms of compression,
yeah,
how's that like incredible summary?
I mean, in terms of compression, you'd have an algorithm. So if you suppose you say the maximum speed is the best summary statistic, your algorithm could also learn that by just taking its input data and coming up with a neural network that outputs the maximum speed.
Okay.
But we're saying you don't actually have to predefine, I think it's the maximum speed. You let the neural network decide itself. You set up the rules that say, okay, the best summary statistic predict the parameters. Yeah, so in that sense, I mean, it's not allowed just to pick the maximum speed, but it's going to predict something. It's going to try and predict the parameters that created the simulation, but that doesn't directly translate to something you can measure, like the mean velocity or. But so you put it in this training loop where you take your parameters, you run a simulation, you get some output from that simulation. So this is all your positions and velocities. You put that in your graph neural network, and then the graph neural network tries to predict what parameters you originally used. And then because you know the parameters you used, you can compare the predictions to the true values, and then train the model. If it's close, the weights don't get updated. If it's really far away, you update the weights of the neural network. So it's learning how best to predict these parameters. And yeah, so I suppose the summary statistic isn't really the same as like a sufficient statistic for it's not like a statistic you can directly calculate. But it's some sort of reduced dimensional representation. So we try this or assess this model on simulated data on these classic zonal models where you have these very discrete modes where an individual responds to its neighbors based on these threshold responses. So if they're outside of a interaction range or inside an interaction range, then the response to that individual changes. and it's standard, repulsion, alignment, or attraction. So these are the different responses they can have. So the idea is that, so these are actually your order parameter here. So these are things you can just directly calculate and use as your summary statistic from the simulations and the real data. So this is the order parameter, the angular velocity, and I think this is nearest neighbor distance. So these are quantities you could use as a summary statistic, but the idea is that we give the neural network images like this, or not images, but data sets like that, and then it has to predict what it thinks, how we generated that data, what the parameters were that generated that data. And what we found was that, you know, although this doesn't look like an amazing prediction, but it is able to, you've given just this fixed snapshot, it is able to make a reasonable prediction about what the parameters were. And you'll notice that as the true parameters get quite large, so these are the alignment radius and the attraction radius. So it does fairly well when they're quite small, but at a certain range, you know, you can't really tell the difference between an attraction radius of 20 versus 25. So at some point, the effect of levels off. But it is reasonably good at distinguishing between parameters, sort of smaller parameters. And yeah, so the take-home message is that if you use this approach, then it's much better than standard ABC, and it's better than this sort of semi-automatic approach, which is also proposed in previous work. So we compared it. So these are the posterior distributions. So you can see we get a much better posterior distribution around the true values. And here we're looking at the log probability of the model. So high is good. And this is for all different combinations of parameters. And we found that using the neural network gives you a much better model score than all the other previous approaches. Yeah, so the main take home is that, you know, if you want to do ABC on complex systems, then training these sort of dimensional reduction algorithms using neural networks is an effective way to go. I think we're up to like 500 individuals. 500. Yeah.
How big are they?
In terms of how many layers, yeah, I'm not sure. Not so big. I'd say like 5 layers max. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't take long to make a prediction. I mean, it's not, you know, it's not a huge computational burden, and you can predict. So when we run the simulations, we do a lot in parallel. So you can just run thousands of simulations in parallel and train the model on these multiple runs at the same time. Right, so I'm just going to talk a bit about, you know, I mean, that's one way you can use graph neural networks. The other way is just to sort of directly simulate. And this is based on a paper from 2020. These authors were at Google DeepMind, and they published a paper on using these graph neural networks to simulate physical systems. So they're comparing a physics-based numerical simulation to a graph neural network simulation. So instead of encoding what you think, how you think these particles behave based on the underlying physics, you just show the neural network training examples from the numerical simulations and then ask it to make predictions. And so you give it a set of initial conditions, you ask it to make a prediction for the next time step, and then you roll forward, give it the time step it predicted. So it's pretty much like a generative language model. You're just constantly predicting based on what previous prediction, and then you can roll this forward. And they got really good results, or results that seem very realistic. So we saw this and thought, if you can do this with physical systems, maybe you could also do it with biological systems such as wildebeest herds. So the main difference, or the main issue with the biological systems, especially for larger animals, is that edges are much more important. So in the physical system, you have these particles that get very close to each other, they bash into each other, you kind of model that interaction. With the wildebeest, they have long-range interactions. They're responding to individuals differently based on where they are relative to the focal individual, and the same for fish schools and lots of these systems. There's a asymmetry in the interaction, that depending on where your neighbor is, you may pay attention to it more, if it's in front of you or behind you. And the complexity of these, how these interactions decay with distance and relative position are more complex in the physical system. So there's been a few papers more recently that have taken this transformer idea and expanded it to deal more with edges and to think more about how attention not only depends on the properties of the nodes. So it's not just the fact that I pay attention to somebody who's running really fast. I might pay attention to them if they're running really fast and they're directly in front of me, but if they're behind me, I might ignore them. So this is a paper from a few years ago or last year, where they introduced this idea of using the edge, properties of the edges, so the properties of the interactions to weight the attention. They did that in two ways. So first of all, they put it into the softmax function, so you have your standard attention based on the properties of the neighbor, and then you have properties of the interaction, properties of the edge, which also affect it. And there's also this gate function, which you can just switch off the attention. So if you want to exclude an individual, you can just kind of turn it off here, set this sigma function to be 0, and then it's gone from your attention calculation. So this would be much more straightforward to encode something like the Vicek model directly, because you can have this nonlinear gate function, which will just switch off purely based on the edge distance. So we're training these models on simulated data again. So if you show these neural networks the Vicek model, can they produce something that looks like the Vicek model? So this is what I'm showing you here. So on the left-hand side, standard Vicek model. On the right-hand side, this is the trained version. So you can get something, you show the algorithm enough time steps, and then it can predict something that looks very similar to the real model. And this is a slightly denser simulation. So if you can see that it does capture the behavior as the density changes. And then there's this classic picture or transition in the Vicek model, where as the density increases, you get this transition from disorder to order. So what I'm showing here is the blue line is the numerical simulations, and the red dots are the graph neural network predictions. And the training is just based on one point. So I think I trained it on the middle point. And then so it sees that type of data. It sees the kind of medium density, and then it can extrapolate either side. So it learns on the medium density, and if you ask it to predict the high density simulation, it knows about this transition. It knows about well, it doesn't know about it, but in that scenario, it can make predictions which match the Vicek model. The next steps on this is training on real data. So this is in progress, but yeah, it's always a bit more difficult than the Vicek model with these nice periodic boundary conditions where everything easy to deal with numerically. And one of the main issues is how to deal with fixed frame of reference and relative frame of reference. So with these, when you have these multiple layers of the network, you're taking in information from your neighbors, and the next layer, that information gets passed on and aggregated. But if you're thinking about, okay, my neighbor is in a certain position relative to where I am, then how do I pass that information on to my other neighbor? So how do you propagate the values of these individuals when what matters is the relative value? So it's not the position, it's the relative position. It's not the velocity, it's the relative velocity. But and if you put it in a fixed frame of reference, then it's giving the model information that the individuals don't have. So the individuals don't know which way is north, or well, maybe they do, but they don't have this sort of common frame of reference that they share. But a bit of an issue in terms of how these models work, and also dealing with barriers and boundary conditions. So I mean, some of the data I've tried to look at is fish schools in the tank. And there you got to think about how they respond to the boundary and how you encode those kind of interactions into the neural network. Right. So last few minutes, I'm going to talk about UAVs and field observations, and so we have a project where we've been developing new technologies, but mainly I just wanted to talk about or just show you some videos which I think are interesting from a sort of statistical physics point of view. And this is a project with an ongoing project. We hope to collect more data, so if people have ideas or thoughts about how to use it and what kind of type of question we could address would be great. So first of all, I just want to mention that we have this project looking at sort of combining these two data streams. So we have GPS collars, which are great. They give you long-term data from a small number of individuals, but you can look at how they're behaving over the course of, well, decades really. This is the Serengeti project's been going for since the 1990s. And then you also have drone footage, which gives you a very short-term. You can see exactly what's going on in a group with a group of animals for 20 minutes, and then you don't see you don't know which animals are which. You can't really identify them. So what we want to try and do is link the two so that we can have a GPS collar that gives us this long-term data, but we can also go out and view this individual repeatedly, see what it's doing, see how it's behaving in terms of its collective behavior. And so we've done that by linking the collar with the drone. And the way we do this is just by having a custom collar that sends its coordinates to a base station, and then we have a drone which can follow the tablet. So these sort of commercial drones, they have a mode where they'll just follow you. So if you go snowboarding, you can just have it on your watch, and the drone will follow you from above, based on your GPS location. And what we're doing is we're just spoofing the GPS on the tablet, so you can on an Android tablet you can convince it the GPS location is somewhere else. So it takes in the GPS of the collar, spoofs the tablet, and then the drone thinks it's following the tablet, but it's actually following the collar, which is what we wanted to do. And this is work that we've been doing. I mean, largely we did this project during lockdown, where we couldn't travel, couldn't go to Tanzania. We did quite lucky to have a study system close to us in Glasgow, which are these Exmoor ponies, which are semi-wild, but also very friendly, and they don't mind having the head halter put on them. So we tried this system there. And this is just the footage showing we can, it does follow this individual, and this individual is going to move eventually, but yeah, maybe I'll just skip on. You trust me, it does follow it, but yes, we did some exploratory analysis just showing that it is close to the collared individual stays towards the center of the frame, and you can look at sort of its near neighbors and make the types of calculations that we'd like to make from the real Serengeti system. So what we want to do is actually put these out in the Serengeti and get these repeated observations, the same individual at different points in the migration. The same individuals always behave the same? Are they always leading, or some of them always following? Are these roles dynamic? As we were talking about at the start, the main challenge are regulatory. So we have the technology, we can do all the technical side of things, but it's just dealing with the regulations. We were out in April collecting drone footage, and the main issue we have is the military observation. So we have to have a military observer that accompanies us, just make sure that we are doing what we said we were going to do, and we have to pay them a daily rate, and that's quite expensive. So it just means that we can't really do these very long-term studies where we have somebody out in the field going out every day for a year following individuals. So the drone.
Yes. No, the people with the
So I mean, in terms
the LoRa antenna can be very far, but I presume that people live closer.
Yeah, I mean the main issue would be that you have to be close to the drone, so you have to be within line of sight of the drone. So yeah, so your collar, the transmission would be further than that. But I mean, you could get permission to go beyond line of sight, but I think that's much more difficult. But yeah, I mean that would be the constraint, that the regulations say you have to be able to see the drone at all times, or you know, it has to be within line of sight. You have to be able to get out of a.
The wildebeest, I mean, they're quite large. No?
Yeah.
So what, I mean, you want to observe how many? Only subset.
How do we know?
Yeah. I mean, so this is actually, I mean, I have another video which is a bit higher, but this is actually now I mean, so when we started this work, the regulations were a bit kind of more in flux, but this is sort of the maximum height you're allowed to film from. So yeah, so these are the you know, you can see the shadows and the real animals galloping along. So this is the height we can film from. So obviously there's much more wildebeest around than there's in the shot. Yeah, and then one of the main things with tracking is that you stay, you know, you don't move around too much because it gets quite difficult to distinguish drone movement from wildebeest movement. So in April we were very strict about not filming and moving. So you know, you pick a spot and you stay there, and the wildebeest just come. You get you get the amount of wildebeest that come through, but you can't sort of follow them around.
And you need a car. They go not that slow, you know.
Yeah, I mean, so we do have the vehicle. I mean, it's not so much. I mean, the drone could follow them as well. It's more the post-processing. So if you want to, if the drone is moving, and you want to calculate the velocities of the wildebeest, then you know, how do you know what's drone movement? How do you know what's wildebeest movement? And if you have a small number of wildebeest, you can like I said, this is background, this is foreground. But if you have a lot of wildebeest, you know, all the algorithms get very confused. But yeah, so this is sort of quite a you know, low density herd. You know, previously we got these very nice higher densities, doing more interesting things. So this is a bit higher than the previous one. And then we see this very nice kind of smoke-like movement as they sort of flow through. And they also have this kind of weird sort of jamming effect as well. That, you know, they're flowing through quite nicely, and they're going to get into a bit of a traffic jam, and then it breaks down.
Then the tube state of that.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I think they're a bit more coordinated than the tube. Yeah. Yeah. So there, I mean, if something happens, and you know, there's nothing there. I don't think there's anything that they're responding to. It's just a little disturbance. One wildebeest responds to something, and then it puts everybody else off. Yeah, so we didn't get footage of this kind of density in April, but so this is from a few years ago. But we're hoping to. So we have a PhD student who's graduating or defending in January, and apply for a fellowship to try and spend a bit of time in the Serengeti just collecting these types of data. Hopefully with the collars, but yeah, I think there's some sort of interesting questions around just the, you know, treating these systems as physical properties and comparing to other systems.
So the one down there, they already knew something was coming up. No?
Yeah, I mean,
Long range, no?
Yeah.
Did you see?
They started to move long before the
Yeah.
wave.
Before the wave.
yeah, you can see it now. Right?
Yeah, they are perceiving something.
Yeah.
The vibration of the ground, probably.
There's something.
Yeah, it could be vibration. Yeah. But I mean, yeah, so they're not all seeing something. I mean, I think there is a hyena in the area, but I don't think they're actively. Yeah. But these ones, yeah, I mean, they go like. But also, there's these. You can see these sort of little instabilities where it gets. You get these kind of little bubbles popping around here, where as soon as it gets quite low density, they just empty out. Interesting.
So, but I mean, how many the hyena? So they are back, no? They're going back to attack one wildebeest, no?
Yeah, I mean, so the hyenas wouldn't really be hunting. I mean, they might be in the area, but they wouldn't be hunting during the day. I think.
I mean, that finds one isolated wildebeest.
Yeah, like a sort of a weaker. Yeah, they wouldn't really have much chance against these. I mean, yeah, if there's one sort of injured, they might have a chance. But yeah, I think this is mainly. I think they're just a bit nervous because there's a hyena just resting, but everything else. So it kind of gets them a bit more sort of receptive to these types of fluctuations, but they're a bit higher density. But there's nothing actually triggering this. They're just, you know, one wildebeest thinks they see something. Well, I mean, I think so. For the the next round of footage is going to be more this level of density, just because of we have to fly a bit lower based on the regulations. So yeah, for this type of footage, I think it would be difficult to distinguish individuals. But the hope is that we get similar behaviors, but we'd just be a bit more zoomed in, a bit closer to them, and then hopefully it would be possible to track. Yeah, so the background is stabilized. So this is quite an old. This is quite an old drone as well. But the newer drones are much more stable. Like this, you can't really tell it's moving at all. This one, the background is stabilized. I think you can see like there's like a little edge here where it moves. So this is sort of subtracting the background and using that to measure I think it's kind of taking this half of the footage and using that to stabilize. It's a bit emptier. But yeah, I mean, I think you could probably track, like individuals here. But yeah, the idea would be to get more, hopefully get more of this type of footage. Because I mean, it just takes a while to get these very high density herds. You have to kind of go out quite a lot to find them. And there's always problems, there's always things breaking, and the raptors attack. So they're around like lunchtime, when it gets a bit warmer, they start to soar and then they attack the drone non-stop. But yeah, so that's everything. So yeah, funders and collaborators. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we're interested.
Yeah.
Okay.
One question.
Yeah.
So that when you have small numbers, so when you start from about the drone, so the advantage, you have all GPS, you could actually put a distance detector between them, no?
Yeah.
But so the drone is just because it gives you the landscape. I mean, you want to have information on it. So what's the advantage when you have small number? Right? So if you color 7 individuals, and then you have distance detector, so you know the distance. So you know everything. No, you don't need the drone. No?
You could, but if
So what's the drone for?
You cannot keep the color individuals close together. They will just move away.
yeah,
No, but I want to say if you are observing something.
yeah. I mean, if you have a sort of small herd that stays together, then yeah, you could just put collars on all of them.
In the controlled experiments that we call country crowd.
Yeah, I mean, even there, I think there's about.
Yeah.
But yeah, in there you could put collars on all of them. Because I mean, I think it's about 100 individuals there, but they are in like discrete little herds with about 10 or 15. So you could put collars on all of those. But with the wildebeest, I mean, once they're
No, with the wildebeest it's clear. No, but when it's a small number, I mean, the drone is to also have information about the landscape so that you get an understanding what they do, even the landscape, or it's just
mainly about the social interactions. If for the wildebeest, if we collar one individual. Sometimes they do come close to another collar, but it's quite rare. But if we want to see that individual repeatedly, we'd use the drone. But yeah, I think maybe zebra you could collar multiple individuals because they stay quite close knit. But I mean, I think it's an open question as well with the wildebeest how much they mix, whether there are these structures. Because some people do think they are little kind of units, little tribes. It's not one big population. But other people think it's just mixing, just random mixing, and we do see the same. We do see collars coming together quite often, which is a bit unusual. Like the same, like 2 individuals next to each other with a collar on, even though they hadn't been collared at the same time. There's like a million wildebeest. I don't know, attracted to each other.
Thank you.